So our next person to interact with is Knut Tveitereid, my co-editor of this volume. Welcome, Knut, to the panel for this. Do you want to say a little bit about your chapter and what your chapter is talking about in the volume?
Yeah, thanks. My chapter is called Lived Theology and Theology in the Lived, and I differentiate between the two. I see theology in the lived as the phenomenon that occurs in practice, whereas lived theology is the scholarly study of that. So, I start by saying that I think the interest for lived theology, which is immense, I must say, is part of a much bigger shift. We've been talking a lot in these conversations we've had about the spatial turn and the spiritual turn and the practice turn and the subjective turn and the pragmatic turn and the linguistic turn and the aesthetic turn. However independent of each other, they're also related, and I think very much comes into the empirical turn. And basically what I'm saying is, I'm asking the question is, whenever someone equipped with qualitative research methodology steps into a research field with a theological interest, is that lived theology? That's a discussion I have. I think all of those terms are underlying the discussion about and the interest in lived theology. I try in the beginning of my chapter to define and position lived theology a bit, discussing it in relation to lived religion. Is lived theology and lived religion connected, and in what way? And discuss a couple of positions there. And also in continuation and discontinuation with adjacent strands of research within theology, such as ordinary theology, everyday theology, popular theology, lay theology, local theology, particular theology, etc.
I'm not looking what the hell are I just couldn't remember what the other program gave. Yeah, okay. Sure.
And then thirdly, I try to develop my own understanding of lived theology, and for that I draw on Sabrina Miller's recent book. Everyone should read that, I think. The book is simply called Lived Theology, and a bit more than that. Here she underlines lived theology as a constructive practice. She argues that lived theology comes into being whenever Christian faith, grounded in the world of experience and life reality, is expressed. I think that's the core of her definition. Whenever Christian faith is expressed with reflection and resonates in the public sphere. And I take that and I develop it a bit further, and I understand lived theology to be a move through expression. And by that I underline the liminal nature of lived theology. My point here is simply to point out that lived theology, both as a research practice and as a practice in churches, etc., not yet has reached a coherent scholarly discourse. It's in the making. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I hear you on that. I agree with you. I think I wrote a little bit in Introducing Practical Theology about really thinking that there's lots of people describing aspects of the same thing, and giving it different names and different definitions, really. And we haven't, some of those names are real, some of those names indicate theoretical predilections towards the thing.
Yeah.
Some of them indicate methodological, like lived religion in a sense, brackets off some of the things that theologians would want to say was important about, you know, a practice or a community or a church or something. But on the whole, I think we're all trying to reach towards the similar sort of thing, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, very much so. And yesterday I spent the day scanning through all the chapters in the book, and to broaden the perspective a bit from my own chapter to the rest of the chapters.
Yeah.
More than half of the chapters, so more than 25 chapters, to some length discuss the concept of theology in the lived or lived theology. So to me, it seems like what we look at when we look at theology with or through qualitative research glasses is maybe lived theology. And the basic problem is that we have so many names for the same thing. There are so many streams that partly connect and partly not connect, and they're fused with all kinds of theoretical presuppositions that I think this is so interestingly, such an interesting thing to trace. And I'm not sure what the future will bring. Maybe we in 10 years will call the thing we have in common, all the theologians that do qualitative research, is lived theology. Maybe not. Maybe we have even more names for the same thing, but I think this is a common and new and interesting interest we share, actually.
But for doctoral students who feel that they need to ground their project in something that feels robust, this is a challenging environment, isn't it? I think this edge of the envelope situation that we're in. A lot of my students reach for the four voices sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, when I've heard Claire Watkins talk about that, she's sort of been rather resentful that something that she's observed through theological action research has then been turned into something that they never intended it to be, a methodological framing of projects.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of the challenge for both doctoral students and advisors, supervisors, I would think, is where are the robust theoretical frameworks to rest your work in?
Well, in my chapter, I do my best at introducing a theoretical idea, at least, and that is to make a shift from a focus on experience and expression to a focus on meaning and meaning making as a core element in lived theology. And for that, I use, or I see theology in the lived as the attempt of making everyday life theologically meaningful, or I flip it and I say to make theology meaningful in everyday life. And for that, I draw on Etienne Wenger's theory of everyday meaning. And he says a very interesting thing, I think. He says that meaning is a negotiation involving the interaction of two processes. The first one is participation, and the second one is reification. And in the duality between them, he argues, he finds a dynamic fundamental to the human experience of meaning, and thus to the nature of practice. To connect this, and with my own words, I think a lot of research has been going on in this, following the lead of practice theory. and then you kind of get stuck in practice and action. And then you have this other strand of more theoretical or theologically informed research, and you kind of get stuck in that and you never come to practice. And following Etienne Wenger, he says that the meaning production occurs in the duality between them. And I think this is just one example of how the field of lived theology actually evolves also theoretically. And for that, maybe becomes more helpful for PhD students.
Yeah, thank you very much, Knut. We're trying to let someone in who wants to get in, which is what's distracting myself and Easton. But unfortunately, Easton, you're going to be on in a second. But thank you, Knut. I mean, maybe it's a little bit pessimistic to say it's a challenge for doctoral students to create a robust environment. Maybe there's enough out there to write an interesting methodology chapter that says, some person says this, some person says the other thing, but I think I'm going to go and do this. So I think there's enough for doctoral students to kind of play that game. But as it develops, I think beginning to get a more sophisticated and nuanced. And I think, well, Wenger's an interesting person to go with.
But I don't think the real challenge is methodologically. I think it is more epistemology, for instance, like, and then read, for instance, John Swinton. What kind of knowledge is this that we're dealing with here? Those kinds of groundings would be interesting for a PhD student, probably.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We need to, we'll obviously come back to Rachel and Knut like we did in the last session.